Throughout our lives, there will be a select few experiences that define us, moments in media that alter the course of our lives. So today, let's take a look at the games that are criminally underrated and underloved that might just do that for you. The games harboring something that a majority of this medium have missed, or the games that deserved so much more. The games that everyone needs to play before they die, that almost no one has. Sometimes a game gets so overlooked it pains you. Prey is one of those. You see, back in 2017, Arcane Studios released their best game to date, to reviews reserved for only the most failed of products. And because of this, the game largely went under the radar and was a commercial failure, which in part resulted in one of the heads of the entire studio leaving in shame. And amongst the player base, it was no different. The game was met with vitriol because of its name, which was supposed to be a beloved sequel to yet another underrated game from early 2006. Yet despite all the hate, this hidden gem is one of the most invigorating experiences I've had in games. The world is mysterious and smart, the story and its characters are gripping, but most of all, the gameplay and systems that surround the moment-to-moment action are unparalleled. Because you see, Prey is built on the backs of some of the greats of all time, like Deus Ex, System Shock, and Bioshock, and from those foundations has crafted something greater than everything that came before. You can choose to tackle any room how you see fit, whether that's sneaking, hacking, disabling enemy defenses, or going in guns blazing. And with each of these actions you take in the gameplay and story, you are slowly pulling yourself to the end where all of your actions will have drastic consequences on the meaning of your ending. Each gun and gadget has multiple uses, which means you can on the fly come up with genius solutions to every puzzle. Like in the beginning of the game when you discover you can use the glue gun not only for freezing enemies, but for building makeshift ladders to high up places too. The game rewards the player for actually thinking about every situation they are in, and this great design is only further exacerbated in the Mooncrash DLC, coincidentally also the most underrated DLC I've played in my life, better than most games on its own. Because Mooncrash takes this genius formula in the base game and then extends it through the use of multiple characters all with their own abilities, racing against a timer that slowly counts down, it makes the game harder but more rewarding. Mooncrash forces you to make hard decisions between how you will manage resources, which characters to take and in what order, and which escape routes to use at what time, all to make the perfect run that will get you off that damned rock. Trying to get all of your team off the moon base before time runs out was one of the most rewarding challenges I've ever taken on in a game, and it's also one almost no one has even played. Prey, and especially Mooncrash, are special because they are games that actually make us think, in a world worth thinking about. The crazy sci-fi story it tells and space station you inhabit in Prey is one you'll never forget. And while the final act of the game does start to become too hectic with samey enemies and fights, whereas the beginning was perfection, it doesn't take away from the fact that the game and its DLC are some of the most critically underrated things of all time. When people talk about the greatest immersive simulation games ever, or just best games in general, there's always discussions of Deus Ex, System Shock, Bioshock, and many more. But I promise you, they all pale in comparison to what Arcane Studios did with Prey, and if you haven't played this game yet, download it right now. There's nothing else quite like it. If you ask most people what their favorite Obsidian game of all time was, many would argue Fallout New Vegas, and a lot of people would then go on to explain why it's actually one of the best games of all time as well, full stop. But for me, it's Obsidian's more recent game, Outer Worlds, that sparked my interest. And that's because Outer Worlds is such an underrated gem in many ways, that people treat like a rejected stepchild to Fallout, when in reality, by many metrics, it's much better. It did review well for many outlets at first, and it had a handful of people singing its praises over time, but recently, it just feels like this game has been forgotten. The story of Outer Worlds takes you across multiple different planets and biomes, and in each of those, there's a story being told about corporate greed, dejected citizens, and weird fanatical cults. It almost feels like a B-movie rendition of most AAA games, but there's so much charm that comes from that. The dialogue is often funny and witty, the stories are oftentimes crazy and wacky, and most of all, the world just doesn't take itself too seriously. And it's because of this that The Outer Worlds feels unlike anything else in the RPG space, with a very distinct tone and art style that come together to offer a great experience most people haven't even played or have never given a full playthrough. Because it's during that full playthrough that you can start to appreciate just how underloved this game really is. The worlds aren't as dynamic in exploration as, say, a Bethesda game, but there is so much freedom in how you create your character or what decisions you can make in dialogue based on your builds, and the companions you bring along the way offer a great addition to every mission, constantly commentating on what you're doing or have done. In fact, even more than the base game, the DLCs for this world have been absolutely fantastic, taking us to new locations and offering new stories that rival some of the best quests in any of your favorite RPGs. And on top of this, the combat in the game is some of the best in the RPG genre as far as mainstream games go, with gunplay that feels precise and quick, and a selection of different guns and gadgets and attachments to choose from that can radically change your playstyle. I do understand why so many people have written off this first game in the series of Outer Worlds due to the feeling that it isn't quite fully realized yet, and I would tend to agree on that front. But it's a huge shame that more people haven't actually given themselves permission to play and love this game, because what's on offer here is a glimpse into an amazing new sci-fi world with many interesting characters, memorable quests, and just awesome game design that alludes back to some of the RPG greats of old, including Obsidian's very own Fallout New Vegas. If you haven't given Outer Worlds a chance yet, play for at least a couple hours just to see how diverse the builds in game are and how fun the story that unfolds is, all in a world that you can truly get lost in. It's an underrated and somewhat forgotten entry into a series I think could be a massive hit in its sequel if it's done correctly, and I think when that happens, a lot of people will come back to this game and realize just how much they missed.
Here we go!
I played a lot of first-person shooters in my life, but unlike many people who play these games for the multiplayer element, my main drive for much of my life was the single-player side of things. Luckily for us though, there have been many notable FPS campaigns ranging from Call of Duty to Battlefield, but it was only this last year that I finally picked up and tried Titanfall 2, and as crazy as it sounds, it was the best FPS campaign I have ever played in my life, bar none. This game isn't unknown or unloved by any means, as many games on this list will be, but it also surely does not have the love it actually deserves in the community. The campaign in this game specifically is quite literally the perfect definition of what fun is in video games. If someone told me right now they only had 5 to 6 hours to play a game and they wanted those hours to be nothing but pure adrenaline and awesome moments, without question I would recommend Titanfall 2, even amongst other standouts like Doom. And the reason for this is Titanfall 2's campaign takes you on a roaring adventure, where it feels like every level and each new location brings on a new set of mechanics and gameplay elements. Like one level where on the fly you can swap between different periods of time in one level in order to evade enemies or just get past locked doors. Or in another where you have to run up the sides of a building as an entire facility collapses, only to be met with a futuristic training facility you must conquer. And throughout it all, the gameplay at the core of it all is perfect. Chef's kiss. It's fast-paced, fluid, and the gunplay feels precise, and the movement mechanics are the best in any game I've ever played. Running on walls and shooting at the same time feels natural, and the moments where you do get to play in the mechs with different powers and abilities feel like a breath of fresh air. But more than anything, what Titanfall 2's campaign does that is so great is it respects your time. There aren't any filler missions or dialogue, there isn't any side quests that are meant to pad game time. Each and every moment you are playing the campaign is a moment well spent. And I wish more games took this philosophy to heart, because nowadays it's all about making a game long so people feel like they got their money's worth. But the smart among us know that there is one currency more important than money, and it's time. And more than most games, Titanfall 2 respects your time a lot, and more people need to check it out because of that and how underrated it is. SOMA is one of the best sci-fi horror experiences I've ever had in games, and one that will make you think about the tragedy of life itself. And that isn't to say everything about this game is great though. I find a lot of the gameplay and voice acting subpar, some of the environmental design questionable, and personally, I'm not a fan of sneaking helplessly by enemies to survive in games. But the core of this game's story and the world it creates is some of the best in the medium. You start out as a naive man named Simon who's trying out a new health program for his brain issues, where the game then quickly devolves into you being trapped in a future top secret research facility filled with mystery. The actual gameplay for most of the story revolves around hiding and sneaking from an assortment of different enemies you meet in game, but the heart of what makes SOMA such a memorable experience is just going through that story for the first time. If you haven't played already, the way in which SOMA slowly unveils the story of what actually is going on and what is happening in this creepy and deserted facility Pathos 2, it's something unlike most games out there. The crazy twists and turns of the story lead you down many unpredictable paths to huge revelations that make us ask questions about ourselves and the biggest things in humanity. And that's what makes SOMA shine so much. It's like a good psychological thriller movie of the days of old, that not only gives us awesome sci-fi concepts to ponder on, but also questions about ourselves that are too haunting to even think about otherwise. The game dives into the very essence of what it means to be human, to be confused, and most of all, to be alone. I'm purposely being vague on this one because I think the game is best played by knowing as little as possible going in, but I can promise you if you love games that make you think, then SOMA is an experience unlike any other. But because it's a smaller indie game with a lot of jankiness, it's only managed to garner a big cult following, whereas I think there are so many people out there that would otherwise love and enjoy this game too. Even if the gameplay is tedious for you like it was for me, and even if it's very slow at times, the payoff by the finale is well worth it, and with one of the most haunting and thought-provoking endings to a game I've ever seen, that makes the entire journey so memorable.
Strasky, come in. I need help in the lab, the scan room.
What happened?
Conrad killed himself after the scan.
Jesus.
If there's any series from the early 2000s that needs to have a comeback, it's Viva Pinata. This game series was well known for its lovable and whimsical nature, and as a kid I spent countless hours and late nights tending to my garden with all the pinata animals inside. The thing that makes Viva Pinata so special though is just how simple it was. There wasn't any insane and deep RPG mechanics, there wasn't competitive multiplayer or a million different ways to upgrade your garden. It was simple. You had a small plot of land that you slowly grew into a sprawling garden, and with each passing day you caught and bred more and more interesting and high-level pinatas to show off to your friends. It's a harken back to a simpler time in games where the biggest worry was just about having fun, and the thrill of the chase to get the new and coolest pinata was amazing. Trying to acquire the rarest candies to attract the most famed pinatas and afterwards mating your spawn together to create a lasting legacy was potentially the most addicting gameplay loop of all time, and even to this day it works so well. Even with more recent entries like Stardew Valley in many ways perfecting the medium, they still don't quite capture the magic of the Viva Pinata series, which was so focused on giving you that high from just the simple things in life. The music was upbeat and made you feel good, tending to the farm was involved without being tedious, and the entire story you went on to build the coolest farm ever is one I'll never forget. It's a series that surely needs to have a comeback in the coming years with some new additions from more recent farming games, but even to this day it stands out as a crowning achievement of the time. If you love farming simulations or zoo tycoons, then Viva Pinata in a lot of ways is the perfect mix of the two. That more than anything is just fun to play at all times, and never fails to put a smile on your face. Something that a lot of games try to do nowadays, but fail. It's one of the most underrated games of all time, and if you haven't picked it up, give it a shot. I mentioned earlier on this list how the failure of Prey for Arcane Studios resulted in one of their best creators leaving the entire studio. Well, for those of you that don't know, the creator was Rafael Colantonio, and the first game from his new studio, just like Prey, is an unbelievably underloved and played game. Weird West takes the player on an adventure across a fantastical western location using 5 different playable characters. And just like the lineage of many of the studio heads before this game, Weird West is all about emergent and simulated gameplay. Moving from location to location takes time, and that means many missions you are on could reach a failure state if you don't do them quick enough. And as you travel, you can stumble upon random events and situations that can change your playthrough entirely. And throughout all of this, you have a main mission of figuring out what exactly is going on in this Weird West. And to do so, you have to play 5 separate campaigns, each with their own character who has their own unique personality and moveset. The genius of the game comes in with how this all intertwines though. The actions you take with one character early on in the story can drastically affect the entire world with your future characters. And you are even able to go back and recruit your old characters to your team as your new characters, something I've not seen in any other games. It's this systematic systematic approach to game design that makes Weird West so awesome, and it carries over to everything. You can use your character to move a barrel to the side of a building in order to climb up on the scaffolding and get to the roof, or you can sneak past the guards through the back door and hide in a dresser, or you can just take your gun out and cause a massive scene. Every mission has multiple ways to tackle it, and the decisions you make on one can drastically affect the world. For example, if you go in guns blazing and murder everyone in your way, you may get a bounty put on your head. And even more crazy, the families of the loved ones that you have killed may now come after you in-game and run up on you while you're in an important mission. And what makes Weird West so amazing though, is that all of these different and interesting systems, whether it be bounties and families, guns and gadgets, or just what upgrade paths you go down for each character, and the narrative decisions you make along with them, they all affect the world in very big ways. So much so that the decisions can literally result in the exile of entire races of people from the lands. It's a type of game that really shows you just why games are so special and what makes them unique. None of these moments could happen in a movie or most other games because the world really becomes whatever you make it. It's funny too because westerns are one of my least favorite genres of all time. Honestly, I just don't really like them at all. But this game was so good on a systematic and design level with so many interesting choices to make and ideas to commit to that I couldn't help but fall in love with it. Sadly, it's so under the radar since it's the first game from a new studio, and it's an indie game that many people will simply look at and decide it's not for them without even giving it a shot. But it truly is one of the best experiences I have had in gaming in some time, and potentially the best immersive sim since Prey. The fact it didn't even get nominated for any awards at the Game Awards and hasn't seen a lot of love from the community is criminal, because I know for a fact that this is the type of game that so many of you will play and wonder, how didn't I find this sooner? As a kid growing up every day after school and soccer practice, I would come home and turn on my Xbox 360 and play my favorite games. Most of those were big AAA juggernauts like Halo and Elder Scrolls, but one of the lesser known yet fantastic games I played during this period and loved was a little arcade game called Marble Blast Ultra. It's a game that is as simple as it looks and also just as fun. You play as a little marble of your choice that rolls around different environments and has to get to the end of the stage on a timer or without falling off. And while it's a simple concept in theory that other games have also replicated, there's something about Marble Blast Ultra that was just so special for the time. Even nowadays, if you get the chance to play it, it's just pure fun. The music, the way the environments shift as you jump and roll around them, and just the sheer amount of interesting level design and obstacles to get past is a testament to the developers. If you just want some mindless fun with friends, this is one of the best forgotten games out there that to this day still holds up so well. And on top of this, the game also has a lot of fun mini games too that add to the thrill with new environments and ways to play that make this type of game one you can put hundreds of hours into. I actually wish more games nowadays came out with the same philosophies as Marble Blast Ultra of no bloat and just a focus on making a game with real great core mechanics that can be built upon in a lot of ways. If you haven't played it yet, just download it today and surely you'll get lost for at least a couple hours. When you hear the phrase Elder Scrolls, your mind probably immediately jumps to things like Skyrim, or for those older and potentially wiser, Morrowind. But the game that lies in between both, Oblivion, might actually be the most underrated Elder Scrolls of all time. It came out in a weird period where RPGs were starting to change from the old stat-heavy and narrative-heavy romps of old to the more standardized journeys we know today. And because of this, Oblivion has a lot of DNA from Morrowind, and also concepts and elements that would later be staples of Skyrim. Playing nowadays, you can see just how true it is too, with a lot of Oblivion's quests being more interesting and in-depth than say Skyrim, but with a familiar combat system and mechanics. But the real magic of Oblivion is just hard to explain, honestly. I played most of the Elder Scrolls games now, and for sure they all have their own charm, but there really is just something about Oblivion specifically that feels different. The music as you walk across the green and wide open plains is amazing, and while the world can feel barren compared to say Skyrim, it actually is almost better for it. Each and every distinct location felt recognizable, and the stories these places tell are some of the most interesting in the entirety of Elder Scrolls, like the Dark Brotherhood's questline of death and despair, or the story of the Grey Fox and the Thieves Guild and uncovering the mysteries of the Long Lost Order. The forgotten quests like the people of Hackdirt, who have been demonically possessed and are starving people living under this quaint little town where terrifying roars can be heard from deep in the cave systems underneath the church. Or the Oblivion gates that, yes, do get old, but provide a magical and fantastical setting more akin to, say, Morrowind. To me, in a lot of ways, Oblivion was everything that Elder Scrolls should be. Morrowind had too many mechanics that got frustrating, like swinging your sword at an enemy and missing for no reason, and Skyrim, for as great as it is, felt like a lot more hollow of an experience with a better coat of paint. But Oblivion was the perfect mix between the two, and the game that seems most forgotten of the modern-day Elder Scrolls, but also the one that truly spawned what an Elder Scrolls game should really be, and for its time was a technical marvel. This was one of the first games ever where NPCs had believable day and night cycles, the world felt open and alive, but also where the systems felt easy to pick up and understand immediately. And in fact, this game even has the best DLC in the series called the Shivering Isles, which to this day is some of the coolest and most memorable DLC content of all time for any game, really. The main story was so much better than most of the games in the series, the environments are beautiful even if they are dated now, and most importantly, just the open world and quests and moments that can happen leave such a lasting impact. Oblivion definitely can be rough around the edges, but still to this day holds up better than, say, Morrowind, and is honestly so underrated for what I think is the best Elder Scrolls game ever made, that most people haven't played. Ha! Ha! I didn't even know what Furi was until this last year. It's a small indie Bosch Rush style adventure where you must travel from room to room fighting different bosses to escape your own hellish prison. A simple idea on paper, but it's the execution here that's so powerful. Between each boss area, you are met with a slow walk to the backdrop of striking visuals and mind-altering music. And within each area, a new boss that is so different from the last, each with their own unique mechanics that must be figured out. The combat is fast-paced and visceral, but the best part really is hearing the music blare as you take on a new opponent and get destroyed, only to slowly learn the boss's mechanics and movesets and come back to crush them. And the whole time too, a strange and distinct narrative is being told by your rabbit friend and others that is almost a psychedelic-like experience. I've never played a game quite like this, but it's so awesome. Literally just the soundtrack alone is worth the price of admission, and I listen to the boss music on an almost daily basis at this point, and I even use it in some of my videos. Even more so too, the combat is just so fun to play, as it's really fast paced but also responsive, and getting a perfect parry followed by a perfect counter feels so satisfying as synth and guitar riffs blast in the background and the areas burst into an amalgamation of color. It's crazy to me that more people haven't talked about this game, and it's only by accident on the suggestion of my roommate that I finally even found out this game existed, because it is one of the best indie games I've ever played in my entire life. Short, sweet, and to the point, and almost no one is even acknowledging it ever even existed. This game deserves a massive and big budget sequel that it will likely never get, but in the meantime, Furi is one of the most underrated and least well-known gems in all of gaming that everyone should check out at some point in their life.
Every second.
Deus Ex is one of the most important game franchises of all time, and it's also one of the godfathers of my favorite genre ever. But while the original many times gets most of the love, I actually think that the 2011 reboot of sorts is actually criminally underloved. While the game did review well and it had its fans on release, nowadays it seems like barely anyone talks about it. But Deus Ex Human Revolution really is one of the best and now most forgotten games of all time. It thrusts the player right into the middle of a conflict with organic and synthetic people alike, with Seraph Industries and other big mega corporations propelling humanity into the next steps of evolution. You constantly are coming up against questions like whether or not humanity should push for more artificial intelligence and human augmentation in a world that is on the brink of chaos. But the true crowning achievement is how it all comes together. The gameplay is tight and well crafted, with each level giving tons of options for sneaking, hacking, or just taking out guards one by one to make your way through different areas across multiple different continents in game. What you upgrade in your character screen can have drastic effects on how you tackle different missions, and it really feels like you can craft your own playstyle that fits what you are into. And more than even most games in our now modern era, Deus Ex Human Revolution felt big. Seeing these giant and massive neon-lit cities and traveling from location to location between each mission made the stakes feel high, and the way the story unfolds and how you get to make those big final decisions that lead to some of the most memorable cutscenes I've had in a game is something I'll never forget. It's one of those games where the story really just comes together in an awesome way, where you're constantly asking yourself what's going on, all while being challenged in gameplay moment to moment. It's a thinking man's game just like the original, but this time with a Hollywood blockbuster budget and style. And all with the unforgettable main character Adam Jensen, who like many big video game protagonists, is a man of few words, but makes them count. If you haven't played Human Revolution yet, I highly recommend it for any of you who love immersive sims or who haven't experienced the series for the first time, as it's a great place to jump in and get started.
Grayson hooked me up with some real tight merch. Those UGG lovers get in my face now, I'm ready to pop. Grayson?
I'm not a huge scary game fan. I grew up hating roller coasters, scary movies, and anything that even resembled a spider. But nowadays, as I've grown older, that rush excites me. But sadly, so many horror games I play just feel boring once the initial adrenaline wears off. Outlast was okay, Resident Evil was too slow, and Phasmophobia grew old quickly. But Alien Isolation was different. From the very moment the game starts, it feels super thematic and interesting. Flying on a ship through space and getting a distress call to help others is a common trope in the genre, but here it just works so well, and the characters and voice acting is superb. The story is interesting, and most of all, the way the horror is done in the game is exhilarating. It's less about constant jump scares and creepy sounds, and more about the ambiance of it all, taking in beautiful yet haunting scenes of death, or just the slower moments listening to the creaks in the ship. And throughout the whole journey, you get to uncover what has been going on and the tragedy of it all. With a lot of horror games, the scares feel like the main driving force carrying you through the extensive playtime. But here I truly fell in love with the world, characters, and narrative, and wanted to know more about everything. It's the experience many get while playing games like Resident Evil, but for me, Alien Isolation is just the more interesting horror theme park. And it's a shame too, because the game never got the recognition it deserved. It should be a staple of the horror genre, but now instead is forgotten by many as an Alien game that just didn't hit the mark. But it's a lot more than that, and even made someone like me, who usually falls off scary games so fast, stick with it to the end to see what would happen. It's a type of horror game that would be good even without the horror elements. They just enhance the game, not make it. So I highly recommend you give this game a shot if you haven't and want to feel a sense of dread.
Depressurizing. Oh, fuck. Hating this. Just shadow me, Taylor. You too, Samuels.
Affirmative.
"2022 was a slow year for video games overall, but the beginning and end marked the release of some truly amazing and under-the-radar experiences. The most notable of these, though, for me at least, is Pentiment. It's a game set in 16th century Bavaria and follows a man named Andreas, who must go on to solve multiple murders in a quaint little medieval town. On the surface, the game is really bland, with no voice acting, no real gameplay, and simply just walking around and reading text off a screen. But what makes Pentiment so memorable is the story it tells and the characters and journeys they go on along the way. Having to figure out who committed these murders is fun because everyone we get to talk to has such a distinct personality, and as you get to know them more, you fall more and more in love with the game. And the real crowning achievement is just how little it holds your hand. For each of the murder mysteries right up until the end of the game, you have to accuse someone of being the murderer. But because of the day and night cycle in game, you only have time to dig into small portions of evidence before you must have your final say, which means you'll likely be accusing innocent people of heinous acts. And after these events, you get to come back years later in time and see the effects that you have had on this city and its people, as the story unfolds based on the actions and mysteries that you have uncovered. For the entire runtime of the game, there's always a strong sense of mystery as to what's really going on, and it makes every discussion and every moment you have with anyone exhilarating, as anyone could be hiding key information at any point. The real thing that makes Pentiment so underrated, though, is just how fantastic of a story it tells, and how the lives of these memorable characters play out, and the effect you can have on a small little town. It's a story about love, humanity, evil, religion, and struggle, and also is a great historical piece for the time that teaches newcomers a lot about the age, or is exciting for people like me who have read many books on the time period from the greats like Martin Luther. Pentiment is a crowning achievement that almost no one will play, because the setting is obscure, the gameplay doesn't exist, and the story is slow and methodical, requiring you to read everything for yourself. But if you put in the time and dedicate yourself to giving this game a shot, it's a story that will last with you forever, and an experience you'll never forget, in a world that's so underrated. For most fans of Bioware, they are either Mass Effect and sci-fi lovers, or Dragon Age and fantasy stans. And in each of these series, there are beloved and timeless games, and ones that just didn't quite hit the mark. But while on the Mass Effect side, I largely agree with the popular opinion that Andromeda is not a great game compared to the original trilogy, on the Dragon Age side, I hold a much more unpopular belief. And that's because I actually think that Dragon Age Inquisition is a great game in many ways, even though it and Dragon Age 2 are both largely hated by portions of the community. Because you see, Inquisition has a lot of issues. The combat feels dated, the horseback riding is horrible, and that's being kind to it, and most of the side quests and side content feel more like what you would find in an MMO than a modern big-budget AAA RPG experience. And it's because of this that many have written off Dragon Age Inquisition as a bad game, or not worth your time. But the thing about Inquisition is it actually has some amazing writing, characters, and game design as well. Yes, the world feels like a bland MMO in terms of quests and objectives, but the actual world itself is teeming with life. Beautiful landscapes and vistas, babbling brooks, massive oceans, and chirping animals everywhere. Simply walking around and taking in the sights of the world is exhilarating. And even more than that, it's the design of how you interact with the world that's so interesting. In Inquisition, you have a mechanic called the War Table, where you can instruct your adversaries to go to different diplomacy or militaristic missions to gain supplies and favors for your army. And in many of these missions, changes will happen in the world, like creating scouting towers in the hinterlands that you can then find in-game that allow more people to travel safely. More than almost any other game I've played, Inquisition really makes you feel like a commander at the helm of a giant army and force being born. And it's because of this that even the more mundane and boring side content becomes meaningful, since you can see the effect it has on your army and the people's morale. And on top of this, the main story is actually quite good too, especially if you include the now cheap DLC content, and the companions that accompany you along the way make it even better. I understand why Inquisition is hated by so many in the Dragon Age community, but truthfully, I actually think nowadays the game is quite underrated. It's a massive and beautiful world filled with interesting lore and political intrigue, with an awesome main story quest and mechanics I'm surprised more modern games haven't really given a go, like the War Table. So many games give us that power fantasy of becoming a hero in a world full of monsters, but not so many are able to pull off giving us a fantasy of being a leader of a true and living army. It's a game that for sure has a lot of misses, but if someone could make this game again with the same interesting mechanics and world, but with Witcher 3 level side content and quests, it would be a masterpiece. If you ask most people how they originally got into the Witcher universe, they most likely would respond with the RPG phenomenon Witcher 3. For me though, it's only recently on stream with you guys that I've actually been able to start to enjoy the game. Because for me at least, the game that actually made me fall in love with this universe and its rich lore is a much smaller and less known game, The Witcher Tales Thronebreaker. A game based around my favorite card game ever, Gwent, that takes you on an adventure helping or damning those you come across. In many ways, it's everything I wished The Witcher 3 actually was. First of all, the gameplay is an evolved form of the card game Gwent, which for those of you who haven't played is an absolutely fantastic and fun whether or not you're new or a veteran. And in Thronebreaker, each and every combat encounter takes place with you going up against different adversaries in a game of Gwent. But you see, this is where the genius of Thronebreaker really shows through. Because each ally you find, or weird creature or person you come up against, becomes a card or deck of their own, each with their own special abilities and powers. For example, you may find a Witcher who is looking to fight monsters as part of your group, and thus can give you some really potent abilities in battle to help against monster cards you encounter. But just as in The Witcher 3, there is massive choice and consequence, so you may choose to spare a monster at some point in your campaign, which will anger the Witcher, thus making him leave your party and removing the card from your deck. It's the way in which the gameplay and story are so tightly coupled in Thronebreaker that make it so interesting. Choices you make in the story can directly enhance or ruin certain cards in your deck. Saving a town full of poor peasants not only will have story ramifications for what happens later in this epic saga, but also can directly affect what cards you will get later, and even what your existing cards can do. This means that everything in the game becomes impactful because you know every decision you make not only affects narrative, but also affects the way in which you interact with the game and its Gwent mechanics directly. And those Gwent mechanics are awesome too, with many fights requiring that you think about your opponent's strengths and weaknesses, sometimes having to create entirely new decks just to take on new opponents you haven't seen before. It's a strategy gamer's dream come true. And honestly, it's just such an underrated and amazing experience that I truly wish more people got to try. It's not for everyone, especially those that can't fall in love with card games, but I promise you, if you give this game the time of day, you will be met with amazing characters, lore, gameplay, and choice and consequence in a way we haven't seen any other game quite pull off. I get why people love The Witcher 3, but for my money, its smaller and more underrated spin-off Thronebreaker is the real best thing that we've seen in this universe. I actually didn't like the first Plague Tale all that much. I found it too slow in combat, and I wasn't connecting with the characters much early on. But that all changed in the sequel, because Requiem is one of the most surprising games I've played in a long time. It's a game I thought I would hate that actually turned out to be bloody amazing and a story I'll never forget. Because at the core of Plague Tale are the characters, most notably Amicia and Hugo, and for Requiem specifically, watching as these two go on a massive and sprawling adventure to save one another is heartwarming. Watching as Amicia cries in pain at what she has had to deal with for the safety of her little brother, and as Hugo releases the demons inside of him to protect his sister at all costs. It's a medieval fantasy story with many fantastical elements more commonly seen in sci-fi stories, and because of that, I loved every second of it. It's emotional in all the right ways, whether that is good or bad feelings, and the world is beautiful and diverse with lots of different locations and places you adventure in. But really, it still always comes down to those main characters and the people you meet along the way, some who betray you, and some who just show how great humanity can be. And on top of that, the gameplay in this rendition is so much better too, with many more abilities to use and faster paced combat sections that don't bore as much as the first. Funnily enough, Plague Tale is exactly the type of game I'm usually not into at all because of the setting and slower pace, but the way in which the game's story plays out is so perfectly paced that it's hard not to be gripped by everything happening on screen. It actually reminds me a lot of the Uncharted games in many ways, with all the bombastic set pieces and things that happen, but in my opinion with a much more impactful and emotional story. It's one of those games that most people won't actually play and finish, especially considering the now much longer runtime from the first, but it's one that has many great slower moments along with fast-paced action scenes you'll never forget. And that core bond between a brother and sister who are hell-bent on saving one another from damnation. This isn't a series of games for everyone, and for me I still do find the first one too mundane, but its sequel Requiem is amazing and so underrated in all the right ways. And sadly, it's the type of game that will never get the love it truly deserves, but luckily that doesn't mean you can't download it and play right now to see for yourself.
Please, you gotta stop this! I'm coming to you!
I tend to be the type of gamer who can fall in love with almost any genre provided a specific game speaks to me, and one of my favorite genres that I don't get to play too often is card games. But you see, what makes Inscryption so good is that it's so much more than just another card game with special abilities and a unique twist. Rather, Inscryption at its core is a mind game, one that has twists and turns you will never expect in the slightest. If there's one game on this list you should not look up a trailer for or reviews for and just jump in and play, it's this one. Because while I won't spoil anything for those of you who haven't played, it has some of the most mind-bending twists I have ever seen in a video game, and goes down a path that makes it much more crazy than just a game about cards. And not only that, but it actually is just really fun to play too, and maybe one of the best simple card games I've ever played. In the beginning of the game, you're trapped inside a strange and creepy hut in the woods and must play a randomized game of cards to escape, but that's really all I can say without giving too much away. What I can say though is that the actual card game itself is very simple but also fun and strategic, especially when pulling random death cards with huge stats. It's always a great feeling. However, it's those twists and turns in the story and the way in which it unfolds before your very eyes that make this game a must-play for those of you who haven't checked it out yet. Because by the end of it all, you'll be left wondering what the hell even just happened and how more people aren't singing the praises of this game and the story it tells. It's hard because what makes this game so great is a spoiler, and telling you that would take away all of its greatness, which is probably a big reason why it's been so hard for people to market this game and many people don't give it a shot. But I guarantee you, you won't expect what's on offer in this great and so underrated game. For anyone that has been following me for some time now, you know that Cyberpunk 2077 is my favorite game of all time. It's a game that was more hyped than almost anything I can think of, yet nowadays is somehow underrated, at least for me, because Cyberpunk is more than the sum of its parts. Most people that bought this game were looking for a GTA clone with neon lights, but what we actually got, I would argue, is a much more meaningful and impactful experience. Cyberpunk 2077 was never about the police chases, bumbling AI, or life paths that were longer than 30 minutes. It's always at its core, for those of us who love the game at least, been about the characters and their story. Watching Judy cry at the death of a friend, seeing Johnny Silverhand become a man he can finally be proud of, and looking in Panam's eyes when she makes a toast to Jackie. It's those moments in the game that define what makes Cyberpunk so special. And while the game has recently had a roaring comeback in a lot of ways, I truly don't think it gets as much recognition as it really deserves. Because this story and the journey you go on, most specifically with its characters, is an emotional and moving piece unlike any other. It's not often I play a game and feel truly connected to its world, characters, and the message it's trying to give. But Cyberpunk hit that tone perfectly. Like when you get to sit on Carrie's boat and listen to his new song as the waves crash against the bow, or playing a samurai song live in front of an adoring audience to fans. Those are the moments in Cyberpunk 2077 that no one's talking about. Instead, everyone has been focused on whether all of the other extraneous stuff was good, like the police, the bugs, and everything. Everything except the core of what makes this game so damn special, and one everyone should take the time to explore on their own at some point. Just make sure you do all the side quests and don't rush the main story, because that's where the beauty of this game truly lies. For a lot of people, growing up as a kid playing video games meant sneaking over to your friend's house to play Grand Theft Auto and commit heinous acts while being chased by the cops. After all, there is a little bit of mayhem inside all of us that we have to release at times. But for me, that escape was actually a game called Mercenaries 2, and it's a long lost and forgotten relic of the past that deserves more love. The mercenary games were all about getting giant guns and blowing things up, all while fighting different gangs and mercenaries. It was one of those games that honestly didn't have an amazing story or lots of deeper meaning. It was just straight up about blowing everything up around you and causing as much chaos as you possibly could. And for the time, there was no other game that did it better, allowing you to get massive tanks, helicopters, and other vehicles to attack and blow up entire buildings with, all while traveling along the countryside and through lush jungles and vast bodies of water in your own theme park. Grand Theft Auto was always more serious and realistic, but Mercenaries was a zany and more bombastic answer to that focused less on the simulation and more on the spectacle. It's funny too because nowadays I actually don't really like games like this at all and find them mindless and boring, but they are nonetheless one of the most popular type of open world sandboxes out there, and for good reason. And out of all the games in this category, Mercenaries 2 is for sure the most underrated that has been completely forgotten to the trials of time, but would be adored by so many even if they tried it today. For me personally, I've grown past these games, but if it's up your alley, Mercenaries 2 is for sure worth your time. Mass Effect 2 ranks among the most popular and beloved games that Bioware has ever made, and because of that, it's also the most common answer given for what the best Mass Effect game is. And while I do understand the love for Mass 2 and its adoring fanbase, to me, it resulted in the first and third games in the trilogy, by far better than the second in my opinion, to become somewhat overlooked in the journey of that series. Mass Effect 1 originally came out when I was in high school, and by today's standards, it's quite dated, I won't lie. The combat is janky, the worlds can feel barren without NPCs in life, but the core of what made Mass 1 so special never changed. Flying onto desolate planets and landing searching for hidden treasures is an experience all its own, and the story told in this first game is by far the best in the series. It's where we first learn about the Reapers, the Asari, the Citadel. It's where we first hear that speech from Sovereign about the destruction of all organic species in every cycle. potentially one of the greatest sci-fi stories ever told, and by far the best story in any of the Mass Effect games. Yet it's the one that the least amount of people have actually played and enjoyed. Most fans of the series got involved during the second game's release, and thus see that as their first introduction to the universe. But I can promise you, as far as introductions go, from a narrative and world-building standpoint, Mass Effect 1 is miles ahead of anything that Mass Effect 2 does. And on top of this, Mass Effect 3 has also been dragged out for its horrible ending, which I personally didn't find all that bad, and it's because of that ending that so many people forget just how great that game truly is as well. That feeling of building up a massive force of every race in the galaxy to go up against the Reapers, the biggest threat we have ever seen. Those final missions and moments with the characters we've grown to love over the whole trilogy, and the best thematic set pieces in the whole series. Mass Effect 2 is beloved by so many because of its characters and the stories they tell. But to me, not only have more recent games like Cyberpunk done that so much better, but that's never what Mass Effect was really about. To me, Mass Effect was about those amazing sci-fi concepts that keep us up at night and world building that put others to shame. Moments seeing your favorite characters go up against the biggest threats in the galaxy. And the games that do that the best are Mass Effect 1 and 3. The games that made me fall in love with this series, but also the two that don't get the love they deserve. Mass Effect 1 is better than all its jank, and Mass Effect 3 is better than its ending. Mass Effect 2 is just an overrated character piece that barely moves the story forward. And that's the hard to accept reality. Growing old is the realization that games that used to be popular that you loved as a kid just aren't finding traction anymore. And for me, that series of games is RTS, or real-time strategy. The first game I ever fell in love with was StarCraft, and from there I tried others like Warcraft and Age of Empires, all big staples to their day. But the one that I can't seem to get out of my head, that was most popular back in the day but now is barely known by the younger generation, is Age of Mythology. Largely overlooked by many due to its older and more popular brother Age of Empires, Age of Mythology takes the same formula and puts us instead into the reigns of armies full of mythical creatures, titans of mass destruction and war, and fierce Greek soldiers. Age of Mythology was one of those games that every weekend you could have friends come over and join up in LAN parties where everyone picked a different civilization and duked it out to see who was best. The game starts like most RTS with you gathering resources to build up an army, and it was all about the management of those resources and your units alike that made the game so fun. For me though, what was really so memorable about Age of Mythology was the campaign. Fighting a kraken with your watercraft while also taking on hordes of minotaurs and ancient beasts was an amazing experience, and the voice acting and set pieces were top of their class for the time. And while in many ways Age of Mythology is a product of the time period it came out in, it's still to this day such an underrated gem that more people need to play. It has all the mechanics that we know and love from other big RTS, but also has a heart and soul unlike anything I've seen in other RTS games outside of StarCraft. Unlike StarCraft though, Age of Mythology is largely underloved nowadays, and it's a great RTS campaign to check out and enjoy if you ever have the time. Not every video game has to be amazing in story, gameplay, presentation, and art style. Sometimes a game can just be good in each section and come together as a product that is more than any of the legs it stands on alone. Mad Max is one of those games. It's been largely overlooked by the gaming community at large, but there is so much to love about this game. The vehicle combat and driving is super fun, and it's thematic as possible, with many different cars and loud sounds and tires that kick up dirt as you traverse across this massive and desolate wasteland. A lot of open worlds nowadays focus on pushing something into your face to grab your attention every 2 seconds, but oftentimes in Mad Max, just looking out miles in front of you at the storm ahead and seeing massive plots of sand is amazing in its own right. And on top of this, the combat in the game is actually quite good, with many movesets that harken back to crowd favorites like the Arkham series. I wasn't especially fond of the story, characters, or acting, but that's never what this game excelled in anyways. It was just about that feeling of being a badass roaming through the wasteland in a tricked out car while going from mission to mission. And in that sense, Mad Max did a great job of capturing the essence that made the movies so special too. It's by no means a spectacular game or anything that will revolutionize the industry, but it is for sure an awesome experience that many people need to play before they die, because it's a largely underrated game in the sphere as a whole.
May we arrive in time to save your black on black from slaughter. These barbarians love to try.
Bioshock is one of the most beloved series in gaming, And because of that, each game in the franchise has come under intense scrutiny and also admiration. The first is thought of as a classic, but I didn't like it that much since I played after Prey, which is the same thing but better in every way. Sorry, it's just facts. And the second is largely thought of as a downgrade to the first that some people actually claim is largely overlooked. For me though, the game in the series that deserves more love is Bioshock Infinite. While the game did receive outstanding review scores and has found love, there's also a lot in the community who detests this game and its convoluted story, arguing that it got rid of what made Bioshock such a special series in the first place. The thing about Infinite though is that it does have a lot going for it. Booker, Elizabeth, and the rest of the ensemble all have interesting personalities and motives, and even more than that, the world of Bioshock Infinite, just like all of the Bioshock series, is fantastic. No longer in Rapture underwater, but this time in the sky, the setting lacks the awe-inspiring nature of the first, but makes up for that in crafting a unique world all to its own. Walking around Bioshock Infinite or gliding from one platform to another is an oddly peaceful experience, and the combat here is improved over the originals, with more verticality and movement incorporated into the otherwise bare bones and standard gunplay with light power usage. Where this game truly shines though is its narrative, because Bioshock Infinite tells a story of many moving parts, with commentary on things like racism in the early United States, colonialism, capitalism, socialism, and any other ism you can think of. And wrapped in this entire think piece is a dive into one of the most interesting mathematical concepts we are on the edge of, that being quantum tunneling and entanglement. It's a weird conjoining for sure, and also the reason that so many fans of Bioshock had an issue with Infinite, because by the end the ideas start to get absolutely crazy, but for me, that's what makes Infinite so underrated and so good. It's its willingness to tackle the big questions in sci-fi and science, while also making us ask questions about our own lives that makes the story of this game so exciting with many twists and turns along the way. This is for sure the most fun to play, best feeling, and in my opinion, most interesting Bioshock that has ever been made. And more people need to give it a shot even nowadays just to see what they have missed. Do any of you have a game from your childhood that escapes you? One that you know you loved and played for hours on end at the time, but nowadays have seemingly forgotten it completely? For me, one of those games is Overlord. And while in many ways it's a shitty 90s video game that's full of problems, it's also such a memorable and underrated game of its time. In Overlord, you control, well, a demonic overlord and use an army of impish minions at your disposal to battle a variety of monsters or puzzles in your way. The writing is wacky, the characters are barely utilized well at all, and it for sure feels like a game of its time, but Overlord is such a fun and awesome experience nonetheless. Ransacking entire towns as you rummage through them and their townsfolk with your massive army, all while making lots of choices and upgrades that enhance you or your minions' abilities. It's a game that can give you that nostalgic feeling of other games of the time like Spyro and Crash because of its art style and gameplay, but also it's much less well known and has a very unique take on the combat in the genre. And it's because of all of this, I truly think Overlord is a massively underrated gem that almost no one's played, especially nowadays. If anything, it's due for a remake and reimagining in our modern era, but nothing will be able to top that feeling that it gives you when you play this game specifically, of being thrust back in a time machine to a different period in gaming, when games were made in a way like they won't ever be made again. I've never been a huge fan of Remedy games, and while I can appreciate how well crafted and unique their worlds are, they just have never been for me. Funnily enough, one of their most recent games, Control, is no different, but is actually underrated nonetheless. Playing the game myself, I wasn't able to ever put it down as the crazy government conspiracy and alien narrative unfolded, and the thing that probably surprised me the most was actually the combat. Being able to literally rip pieces of the building out from under you and then fling them at enemies was never not extremely satisfying, and it resulted in a gameplay loop unlike anything else I've ever played in games, where using my actual guns and other weapons felt like the least satisfying way to dispose of enemies. On top of this, the art style and Control is distinct and one of a kind, with almost the entire game taking place in creepy and abandoned high-tech government facilities that are clean and utilitarian that almost tell a story all on their own. And this whole package comes together to provide such an unforgettable and haunting game that even for some like me who have trouble loving Remedy games, couldn't help but not put down for the entire runtime. It's another mind-bending thriller game which I seem to have a lot of on this list. But more than that, it's also just a game with amazing fluid gameplay and flying and telekinetic powers that set it apart from everything else. Trust me, if you haven't at least given this game a shot, download it and get to the first big combat section where you get to see a well-kept and pristine room get transformed into pure rubble due to your immense power, and tell me you aren't happy. The Call of Duty series is one of the biggest and also one of the most hated in all of gaming, but that doesn't mean COD hasn't seen some amazing entries in the decades-long lineage. Some standouts for most fans are the Black Ops and Modern Warfare games, as well as World at War. But for me, the most underrated in the series came at a time when Call of Duty was most hated and not selling well: Infinite Warfare. It was extremely popular to hate Call of Duty at the time, as it was selling worse and worse every year with so many issues in multiplayer, along with no Warzone in sight yet. And I think because of that, Infinite Warfare never got the recognition it deserved, but instead just saw an army of rabid fans biting at its heels. And that's because the campaign to this game is actually really awesome, and one of the best in the entire COD series, even to this day. It's the COD game that took us to the early 2080s far into the future, and because of that has robots and ships flying through space that you get to go on, almost resembling a Titanfall entry rather than something that we see in COD. So naturally, this caused a lot of fans to be apprehensive from the get-go, but the actual campaign itself is so great and has many interesting sci-fi stories and that same AAA budget and action we know from the other games in the series. And this campaign was also home to some of the best emotional moments in COD history, with scenes that you can't help but shed a tear at, followed by moments of intense action set pieces that rival storming Normandy in COD 2 or No Russian and All Gillied Up in Modern Warfare. Sadly though, almost no fans actually gave this game a shot, and on top of this, the actual mechanics of movement and traversal are so fast paced and include so much more verticality because of the future setting that I actually find this COD in many ways to be more fun than the other bare bones entries, but I see why people disagree there. Either way though, if you haven't at least played the campaign for this game, it's massively underrated nowadays and never got the love it deserved because of the state the entire series was in years before Infinite Warfare even came out. And as someone that isn't even a huge Call of Duty fanboy anymore, this entry reminded me of just how great the series can truly be. And it's also the game that got me excited to see where the Call of Duty teams are going with their new sci-fi games potentially in the future, now that they won't be working on COD every year. I've always been a sucker for deep and emotional games that are short and sweet, whether it be Journey, Inside, or whatever walking simulator with an interesting twist you can think of. But one of these short and sweet indie games that hasn't gotten nearly enough love is Before Your Eyes. It's a game based on a simple concept where every time you blink, you move forward in the story of a person's life. And while it's simple on the surface, it's the heartwarming story this game tells and how it unfolds that makes it so meaningful. The art style throughout is beautiful and the narration is fantastic, all accompanied by your friendly wolf companion all along the way. It's another one of those games I don't want to spoil anything for, especially since it can be such a short experience, but all I can say is it's well worth your time and can be completed in just one short sit-down session, but it may just leave an impact on you that lasts a lifetime. So if you guys like short and sweet experiences that can leave an impact and gut punch, then this is one of the most underrated games in that category to do so, that so many more people should be talking about, and I wish they were.
Now play the C major chord I taught you.
And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know down below what your most underrated games are and what you think everyone should be playing or what they would enjoy. Also, I've appreciated all the support from you guys who have been coming by on the streams I do every weekend to come say hi while I play games. It's awesome talking with you guys and seeing who my community is and just getting to know you guys a little bit better. As always, until next time.